Hey guys, tonight we're not riding into battle, deciphering ancient laws, or crawling through plague-ridden alleyways. No, this evening, we're going somewhere much softer, somewhere quieter. We're diving into something that medieval people didn't write about in royal decrees or war chronicles, but something that shaped their lives just as much. Love. Or, at least, their very peculiar version of it. So go ahead, get comfortable, dim the lights, wrap yourself in a blanket, and maybe let a little background fan hum if you like that sort of thing. This isn't a tale of passionate kisses under moonlit towers. Well, maybe one or two. But more often it's about awkward glances at market stalls, entire families negotiating who marries who, and people falling in love while sharing chores, or a goat. You see, medieval dating, if we can even call it that, was rarely about just two people. It was about families, money, reputation, church rules, and sometimes luck. There were rules for courting, customs for engagements, and rituals that could make or break a union before the couple ever locked eyes. And yes, romance did exist in poems, prayers, and sometimes in secret letters tucked beneath a cloak. But it had to find its way through a tangled mess of expectations, superstition, and tradition. We'll talk about all of it. From nobles writing flowery love poems they were too shy to read aloud, to peasants shyly flirting over bread ovens and turnip baskets. From sacred vows exchanged under church bells to whispered goodbyes before one of them marched off to war. Some found love, some found scandal, and many just hoped their future spouse at least smelled okay. If you're new here, welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where the past drifts by gently and nobody shouts. If you like this kind of soft, strange history, you can subscribe, but only if you really feel like it. We won't negotiate your dowry or send a priest to guilt you into it. So take a breath. Let the flickering light of a candlelit village settle in your mind. Somewhere, a lute plays faintly, and in the distance, two people are pretending not to look at each other too long just in case anyone notices. Tonight, you're walking with them, quietly, curiously, one muddy step at a time. Let's begin. So, let's say you're young, single, and living in medieval Europe. Your clothes are scratchy, your teeth are, let's say, rustic. And your concept of a good time involves a harvest festival, not swiping left on a stranger holding a falcon. How do you meet someone? The answer is slowly and rarely alone. Meeting someone in the Middle Ages wasn't as spontaneous as a bump in the hallway or a message that says, "You up?" In fact, most people didn't date in the way we imagine. What you had were communities small, tight-knit, and full of people who knew your name, your parents' debts, and whether you still wet the bed at 10. Romantic mystery didn't exactly thrive in this setting. For peasants, the most common place to meet a potential partner was the village, more specifically, through work. You might be repairing fences, tending animals, or baking bread alongside someone who made your heart beat just a little faster, not that you'd say anything out loud. Flirting was quiet. Maybe you offered help when it wasn't needed. Maybe you complimented someone's turnips. Or maybe you just stood nearby and hoped your presence said what your words couldn't. Festivals were a big deal. These were some of the few times young people could mix more freely. With music, food, and a little fermented encouragement, people who'd barely made eye contact in the fields might suddenly find themselves sharing a dance. And if your village hosted a maypole or summer feast, there was a good chance someone's heart would flutter before the ale ran out. Nobles, on the other hand, had a different set of problems. For them, romance was often secondary to alliances. Marriages were arranged to gain land, money, or power, sometimes all three. But even in those cases, there were occasional sparks. Nobles might meet at court, during tournaments, or through carefully organized visits between families. If you were lucky, you found someone attractive and politically useful. If not, well, at least the wine was decent. There were also go-betweens. If a young man had his eye on someone, he might send a friend or relative to make the first move, often with a gift or token, a comb, a ribbon, a tiny poem if he was feeling bold. Direct communication wasn't always possible, especially for noble women who were often heavily supervised. In some households, even making eye contact with the wrong person could get you a firm lecture, or worse, a sudden engagement to a stranger in another province. Letters were another secret weapon. For those who could write, love letters became a way to say the unsayable. Filled with metaphors and flowery language, they might be passed through servants, slipped into baskets, or hidden in books. One medieval poet described his heart as a wounded deer limping through the forest of his lady's disdain. Dramatic? Absolutely. Effective? Sometimes. In cities, things were a little livelier. With markets, guilds, and more diverse communities, young people had more chances to mingle. But even there, public behavior was watched closely. A young woman walking alone could be judged harshly, especially in wealthier circles, and young men could easily gain a reputation, not always a good one, if they were too familiar too quickly. There were also religious events, pilgrimages, saints' days, and church gatherings. It sounds strange now, but for some, church was less about quiet reflection and more about seeing who else was around. Pilgrimages especially could be romantic. Imagine traveling with a group for days, maybe even weeks, walking beside someone who shares your journey, your food, and your sleeping space under the stars. Sure, you're doing it for spiritual reasons, but it doesn't hurt that someone's eyes catch the firelight just so. And then there were chance encounters. A dropped bucket, a runaway pig, a merchant's cart tipping over at just the right time, the stuff of stories. The truth is, even in a world ruled by rules, rituals, and responsibility, people still found ways to fall in love, quietly, clumsily, like we always have. Of course, not all matches were happy ones. Sometimes the spark never came. Sometimes love was one-sided. And sometimes people simply did what they were told. But hidden among the records and rules are glimpses of real affection of people who found one another in the mud, music, or murmurs of a medieval life. So how did people meet back then? The same way we do now, in the end, through work, through friends, through festivals, accidents, and unexpected moments. The stage was just set differently. The clothes were heavier, the stakes were often higher, but the feelings? Still familiar. Because whether you're in a linen tunic or a denim jacket, the first step toward love is always the same: noticing someone, and then hoping they notice you back. If you thought getting into a relationship in medieval times was tricky, just wait until you hear how they handled the step between "we're kind of a thing" and "we're married now." Spoiler, it was weird, complicated, and occasionally involved witnesses hiding behind doors. And yes, there was very little jewelry involved. Let's start with the basics. In many parts of medieval Europe, engagement wasn't a flashy event with a kneeling proposal and a diamond ring big enough to be seen from orbit. Instead, it was a verbal agreement. Two people, or more often, their families would come to a spoken understanding that marriage was in the works. This was called a troth plight, or in plain language, a promise to marry. Sometimes the couple would even say, "I plight thee my troth," which sounds fancy but really just means, "Yeah, I'm in." Now, here's where things get complicated. According to medieval canon law, a promise to marry could be binding even without a priest, a church, or any kind of document. All it took was two people saying in front of witnesses that they intended to be married. And if they said it in the present tense, like, "I take you as my wife," boom, they were married. Just like that. Instant matrimony. Hope you meant it. This led to a lot of legal headaches, especially when someone later tried to deny it. Courts were flooded with he said, she said situations, where one party claimed there had been a promise and the other said no such thing ever happened. Cue the dramatic entrance of the surprise witnesses, who may or may not have been eavesdropping through a wall. Because of this, some people started making their engagements more public. They'd announce the betrothal at church or hold a small gathering. In some cases, they even hired notaries to write things down. But for many couples, the spoken word remained the foundation. Rings, if exchanged, were more about symbolism than legality, and not everyone could afford one anyway. And just in case you're wondering, no engagements weren't necessarily sweet and romantic. For noble families, they were strategic. You might be betrothed as a child to someone you wouldn't meet until years later, or you might have your engagement broken off if the political winds shifted. A neighboring lord might suddenly become a liability. A cousin might become available. And you, the human chess piece, would be moved accordingly. Still, even among the common folk, engagements were rarely just about love. They involved dowries, that is, money or goods that a bride's family would provide, and sometimes bride prices, which the groom's family would pay. These transactions could get tense. If someone promised a goat and didn't deliver, it might stall the whole relationship, because nothing says true love like livestock negotiations. There were also traditions to seal the deal. In some areas, couples would exchange gifts: a belt, a dagger, a lock of hair. In others, they'd share a meal or drink from the same cup. A shared ale was as binding as any notarized document. And if they consummated the relationship, yes, that way it often meant they were already considered married, whether or not the formal ceremony happened later. This led to another delightful medieval problem: secret marriages. Some couples went off on their own, spoke the magic words, and declared themselves wed. Maybe it was romantic, maybe it was reckless. Either way, it bypassed the whole community process. And while technically valid in the eyes of the church, these clandestine unions caused chaos for families, priests, and especially local judges. To combat this, the church eventually pushed harder for public weddings in front of clergy and witnesses. But old habits die hard. For a long time, a whispered promise in a meadow could hold as much weight as a full cathedral ceremony. Imagine that. Two people sneaking out behind a barn, declaring their love in the present tense, and going home technically married. Very efficient, very chaotic. In some towns, officials tried to introduce waiting periods between engagement and marriage, like a medieval cooling-off period, not always successful. And in many rural areas, people just did what their parents had done, and their parents before them. Rituals passed down, modified, misremembered, but still followed. For example, in some German villages, there was a tradition of hand fasting, literally joining hands to symbolize the union. In Scotland and Ireland, it became common enough that it eventually made its way into wedding customs we still see today. You've probably watched a movie where two lovers clasp hands and say vows. That's medieval DNA right there. But even in places with more formal customs, things could get fuzzy. What if a promise was made but never fulfilled? What if one party claimed coercion? What if both changed their minds, but the families didn't agree? These weren't just awkward situations, they were legal nightmares. So, let's say your medieval marriage has been arranged. You've said the vows, you've endured the feast, and you've even survived the awkward bedding ceremony. Life should settle into routine, right? Well, not always. Because love, or at least desire, isn't always well behaved. And in the Middle Ages, cheating wasn't just risky, it could be downright dangerous. Let's get this straight. Adultery happened. A lot. It may surprise you, given all the rules and religious warnings, but medieval folks were just as complicated and curious as we are. Temptation existed. Opportunities appeared. And not everyone stuck to the script. But before we dive into the scandal, let's define what adultery actually meant back then. The church considered it a grave sin. For men, sleeping with a married woman, even if he was single, was adultery. For women, sleeping with anyone other than their husband was adultery, no matter the situation. The imbalance was real, and yes, deeply unfair. The consequences could be harsh. If caught, punishment ranged from public shaming to excommunication. In some places, nobles might be fined or banished. Peasants might be flogged or paraded through town. And for women, the social fallout could be brutal. A woman accused of adultery could be disowned by her family, thrown out of her home, or even imprisoned in a convent, whether or not the accusation was true. Despite the risks, illicit affairs did happen, and they came in many forms. Some were secret flings between neighbors. Some were long-running romances behind closed doors. And some played out in castles, courts, or cloisters, with all the drama of a soap opera. One famous example, King Philip IV of France and the scandal of his daughters-in-law. Around 1314, rumors spread that two of his sons' wives were having affairs with knights from the royal household. An investigation followed. Torture was involved, and two women were found guilty, their lovers executed gruesomely. The princesses were imprisoned for life. It was messy, political, and deeply tragic, all because of forbidden love and court gossip. But not every affair ended in execution. Some managed to fly under the radar. In towns and villages, affairs might unfold in secret behind haylofts, during festivals, or in stolen moments between chores. There are court records of women sneaking off with lovers while their husbands were out at the fields, of men slipping away to visit women in nearby parishes, even of priests, yes, priests being accused of seducing their parishioners. Monasteries and nunneries weren't immune either. Despite vows of chastity, some monks and nuns engaged in secret relationships. There are recorded cases of cloister walls being climbed, of love letters passed through cracks, of pregnant nuns being quietly relocated. It was risky, but love, or lust, has always found a way. Of course, not all cheating was romantic. Sometimes it was transactional. Prostitutes existed in every medieval town, sometimes licensed, sometimes persecuted, always controversial. The church condemned them, but cities taxed them. Brothels were both public secrets and essential safety valves for the male population. And married men, predictably, made up a good portion of their clientele. There were also cunning strategies for covering one's tracks. Lovers arranged secret signals like placing a candle in a certain window or wearing a specific color on feast days. Some used go-betweens, trusted servants or neighbors who carried messages. Others met at churches, not for worship, but because it was one of the few places they could blend in with a crowd. Confessionals sometimes hid more than sins. But here's the thing. Cheating wasn't always about passion. Sometimes it was about power. A noble might seduce a servant to prove dominance. A landowner might exploit a widow in need. These stories are darker, uncomfortable, but part of the historical truth. Not every affair was a love story. And let's not forget jealousy. Accusations of infidelity, true or not, could destroy reputations. Women were especially vulnerable. A husband might accuse his wife of cheating to gain legal control, to shame her family, or to avoid giving her property. Sometimes, even dreams were considered suspicious. If a man dreamed that his wife had a lover, it might be taken as a sign, especially if the local priest had a flair for drama. Interestingly, some communities tried to manage temptation with custom. In parts of medieval England and France, certain festivals became social pressure valves, moments where rules bent just slightly. On May Day or Carnival, flirtation was tolerated, even encouraged. People dressed up, wore masks, danced together. Sometimes it was harmless fun, sometimes less so. There were even love spells. Yes, actual spells. People visited folk healers or cunning women to gain charms that might inspire affection or prevent a lover from straying. These spells involved herbs, whispered prayers, symbolic knots, or even nail clippings. Most were harmless, some bordered on creepy. But the belief in their power shows how desperate people were to hold on to love, or at least control it. And what about the children born from these affairs? Illegitimacy carried real stigma. Bastards, as they were called, often couldn't inherit land or titles, but they weren't always outcasts. Some were raised quietly within families. Others found places in monasteries, military ranks, or trade guilds. And a few, like William the Conqueror, rose to power despite the label. As always, the church tried to maintain order. Confession and penance were encouraged. Sinners were told to fast, pray, give alms, or make pilgrimages. The idea was to cleanse the soul, but it didn't always stop the behavior. Adultery, like gossip and gluttony, remained stubbornly popular. In the end, medieval cheating was a reflection of medieval life. Messy, complex, and human. Love didn't always follow the rules. Desire didn't wait for permission. And the heart, however inconvenient, often had plans of its own. So next time someone tells you people in the Middle Ages were more moral or more disciplined, just smile quietly. Then tell them about the nun who escaped her convent to meet her lover behind the tannery. Or the lord who built a secret staircase to his maid's chamber. Or the peasant girl who wore a red ribbon to signal her affection right under her husband's nose. Because in every age, love makes fools. And sometimes, fools make history. If you've ever nervously handed someone a scribbled note in class or agonized over which emoji to end a message with, you might relate just a little to the romantic games of the Middle Ages. Because medieval people didn't just fall in love with a glance and get married the next day. No. Courtship was often a slow dance, full of strategy, symbolism, and sometimes vegetables. Let's begin with gifts. Giving someone a present wasn't just a sweet gesture, it was a coded message. A ribbon, for instance, could mean, "I'm thinking of you," but also, "I hope you're thinking of me too." A pair of gloves might imply a kind of promise or even mild possession. And if someone handed you a piece of fruit, yes, even a pear or an apple that could be shorthand for flirtation, fertility, or in some cases, a literal invitation to dinner. In a world with no texting, tokens did the talking. Poetry, of course, was the medieval version of a love confession via DM. But not just any poetry. Courtly love poems were elaborate, structured, and often rhymed with painful intensity. A knight might pen a dozen verses, declaring how the lady's eyes were like twin stars, and her voice sweeter than birdsong. And she, if she was moved, might reward him with a smile or a scarf, or maybe nothing at all. Sometimes, just reading the poem aloud in her presence was the boldest move he'd make. Now here's where it gets interesting. Not all flirtation happened behind closed doors or with parchment and ink. In villages, markets, and churchyards, people flirted in plain sight. They exchanged looks while passing buckets at the well. A brush of fingers while handing over bread could linger just long enough to suggest something more. There was a whole world of implied meanings. How close someone sat, how often they showed up to the same sermons, whether they dared to walk a little slower when they saw you coming. Even dances had their own language. At feasts or festivals, folk dances allowed couples to hold hands, spin close, then separate again, all under the approving eye of community. It was public, but still tinged with intimacy. A dance could be innocent fun, or it could be a bold declaration. But love, like everything else in the medieval world, had rules, and these were laid out in guidebooks, actual manuals written for nobles and lovers. One popular text, The Art of Courtly Love, explained the proper way to woo. how to respond to affection, and what to do when your beloved seemed disinterested. Some of the advice was oddly specific. For example, it warned that love between peasants wasn't true, courtly love, a rather snooty opinion. It also included imaginary dialogues, like, "If the lady says she is too shy to speak with you, respond thus." Think of it as the 12th century version of a flirting script. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of reading romance guides. Most people simply followed the examples around them, copying how others courted, mimicking what seemed to work. If a shepherd gave a carved spoon to a girl and she smiled, well, perhaps that meant spoons were in fashion this season. There were risks too. An uninvited poem could be seen as overstepping. A token given too early could be misread as desperate. And in some cases, if the love was forbidden, say, between a noblewoman and a low-ranking soldier, even a smile might be dangerous. That's why many gestures were subtle. It allowed room to retreat. Denial was always possible. "Oh no," someone might say, "that apple was just a snack, nothing more." But when everything aligned, the words, the glances, the gestures, love bloomed. Slowly, carefully, with all the sweetness and uncertainty of any human era. So the next time you overthink a message or wonder if they meant to brush your hand, remember, medieval hearts were just as unsure, just as hopeful. Love, in every century, speaks its own language. And often, it begins with something as simple as a ribbon, or a poem, or a look that lingers just a second too long. Not every love story in the Middle Ages ended with a feast and a happily ever after. In fact, some romances were never meant to begin in the first place. Tonight, let's slip quietly into the world of forbidden love, where affection had to hide behind shadows, letters had to be smuggled, and even a passing glance could be dangerous. Let's start with the most obvious kind of forbidden love, the one that crossed social classes. In medieval Europe, a noble falling in love with a commoner wasn't just frowned upon, it was considered a disruption to the divine order. Nobles were expected to marry other nobles. Land had to stay within families. Titles couldn't just float away on the wings of emotion. So, if a baron's daughter fell for a blacksmith's apprentice, well, someone was bound to get scolded, or worse. But love, as it often does, had a way of ignoring the rulebook. There are stories whispered more than recorded, of noble women sneaking out under cloaks, of stable boys learning to read just so they could write back to the girl in the tower. Most of these romances didn't end well. If discovered, the punishment could be severe: exile, forced marriage, or imprisonment. But still, people risked it. Then, there were religious boundaries. Christian and Jewish communities lived side by side in many parts of medieval Europe, but interfaith relationships were strictly forbidden. Church leaders warned against marrying outside the faith, and laws in some regions banned such unions outright. Still, there were exceptions: secret weddings, runaway couples, and quiet cohabitations that slipped under the radar. These relationships were rare, but they happened, and the people involved paid a heavy price for crossing those lines. And we can't forget the rules imposed by the church itself. Clergy were expected to remain celibate, or at least pretend to, but behind monastery walls, there were plenty of stories. Some monks fell in love with local women who visited the abbey gardens. Some priests had housekeepers who stayed a little too long and left behind suspiciously familiar children. Technically, these romances were off limits. In practice, well, love tends to ignore technicalities. Speaking of taboos, let's talk about same-sex relationships. While the medieval world lacked our modern vocabulary around sexuality, that doesn't mean those relationships didn't exist. They absolutely did, sometimes hidden, sometimes coded, sometimes visible in poems, letters, or art. But the risks were high. Homosexual acts were criminalized in many parts of Europe, and punishments could be brutal. Still, History gives us glimpses of companionships that clearly ran deeper than friendship. Two women buried side by side with joined hands. A knight who never married but wrote years of poetry to a male squire. We don't know the full stories, the records were often erased or never written, but the emotions linger between the lines. And then there were the love affairs that broke marital vows. Adultery in the medieval world was dangerous territory, especially for women. A man caught cheating might face public shame or a church fine. But a woman? She could lose everything: status, safety, even her life. In noble courts, adultery was sometimes tolerated when it was politically convenient. But for peasants and townsfolk, it was often a scandal that the whole village whispered about and judged harshly. Yet even within all these taboos, love found a way. Secret meeting places were chosen with care: a forest path at dawn, a market stall at dusk, the quiet corner of a chapel. Messages were sent through trusted friends or hidden in the folds of laundry. Songs were sung with double meanings, glances held just a heartbeat too long. Every risk made the romance more intoxicating. Every stolen moment felt like a victory. And the emotions were real. Just because the world said no didn't mean the heart listened. That's something universal across time, place, and culture. People in the Middle Ages wanted what people want today: to be seen, to be chosen, to be loved, even when society didn't approve. So if you've ever loved someone you weren't supposed to, if you've ever felt that ache of impossible timing or quiet longing, you're in good company. Somewhere, 800 years ago, two people stood under moonlight, whispered each other's names, and dared just for a moment to hope. Let's dim the lanterns a little more for this one. Imagine a world without phones, no internet, no quick messages or emojis. If you had something to say to the person you loved, something private, tender, maybe even forbidden, you had to write it down, on paper, with ink, and hope the messenger didn't read it first. Welcome to the art of medieval love letters. In a world full of walls, social, religious, physical letters became the rope ladders that lovers used to climb over them. Written in Latin, French, or the local dialect, these notes weren't just about words, they were loaded with hope, risk, and longing. Some were short and hurried a quick scribble tucked into a basket of bread. Others were elaborate, with carefully chosen metaphors about roses, stars, and eternal devotion. Think less "wid" and more "my soul is a candle that burns for you across the dark seas of fate," that sort of thing. But words weren't always safe. If a letter fell into the wrong hands, it could ruin reputations, start feuds, even trigger duels. So lovers got creative. They invented codes like changing the names, using nicknames only they would recognize, or writing in mirror script. Sometimes, entire phrases were replaced by symbols or small drawings. A heart pierced by an arrow, a swan in flight, or a flower missing a petal. These little illustrations meant more than words could say, and less than a suspicious father could prove. Seals were important too. A wax seal wasn't just for decoration, it was a medieval security system. Each seal had a unique emblem, a family crest, a personal symbol, or even a carved image of a flower or animal. If the seal was broken, the recipient knew someone had peeked. If it was intact, the message remained private, mostly. And let's not forget messengers. Delivering a love letter wasn't just a quick errand, it was a trust exercise. Messengers could be loyal friends, younger siblings, or even household servants who just happened to be passing by. They had to dodge questions, maintain a straight face, and occasionally claim they were delivering prayer books or wool samples instead of confessions of undying love. Some of them were probably the best actors of their generation. But even if a message made it safely, it didn't always get the answer the sender hoped for. Sometimes the reply was just as subtle: a returned handkerchief, a flower dropped on the doorstep, or no response at all. And in those cases, a person might read and reread the original letter until the ink faded and the paper frayed, memorizing every line like scripture. Love tokens were another way people sent messages without words. A piece of ribbon, a lock of hair, a small carved trinket each had meaning. These weren't expensive gifts, they were sentimental ones. A knight might tie a lady's favour around his arm before a tournament. A village girl might sew her initials onto a scrap of cloth and hide it in her beloved's satchel. These were quiet promises, things to hold on to when distance or danger kept lovers apart. In some circles, especially noble courts, symbolic gestures became an art form. The way a fan was held, the flower chosen in a bouquet, even the number of steps taken during a dance, all could signal attraction, rejection, or interest. It sounds complicated, but think of it like medieval texting. Limited characters, easily misunderstood, and full of meaning if you knew the code. Some of the most beautiful love letters from the period come from people we don't even know by name. Scribes, widows, students, travellers. Their notes survive in archives, between legal records and monastery inventories. One writes, "Though I have no lands to offer, I send you my thoughts each evening, like birds to your window." Another says, "Your absence has made the stars colder." They weren't famous. They weren't poets. But they were in love. Even saints weren't immune. Some letters between religious figures and their companions blur the line between spiritual admiration and deep emotional intimacy. Historians still debate whether these were platonic bonds or something more, but the language is undeniably tender. And when you're alone in a candlelit cell, praying by moonlight, even friendship can feel like salvation. So the next time you write a message to someone special, a text, an email, a note on a napkin, remember you're part of a very long tradition. A tradition of people who dared to say how they felt, even when the world told them not to. People who folded their words with shaking hands and sealed them with hope. Because sometimes, love isn't loud. Sometimes it's just ink on parchment, sent quietly across the miles, waiting to be read by the right person. Imagine trying to flirt while someone's staring at you the entire time. Not just anyone, but your aunt, your father's steward, or a monk with a notebook. Welcome to medieval dating under supervision. Privacy wasn't just rare, it was basically illegal. Let's begin with chaperones. For most young women, especially those from noble or well-off families, the idea of going somewhere alone with a man was unthinkable. It wasn't about trust. It was about reputation, family honor, and future dowries. A single unchaperoned moment could spark gossip, and gossip could ruin everything. So, wherever she went, a girl of marriageable age was often accompanied by someone older, usually a female relative or a trusted servant. This person's job? To watch, to listen, to interfere if the conversation wandered into dangerous territory like, "You look lovely today." Even at feasts or festivals, things weren't as free as they might appear. Noble courts had their own forms of surveillance, elegant, discreet, and extremely nosy. A princess might seem to be exchanging casual conversation with a young knight, but across the room, a chamberlain was noting every word. Courtly love, for all its poetic flair, was actually watched with eagle eyes. A poem might be sweet, but a whispered secret behind a tapestry, that could lead to consequences. In castles and manors, parents sometimes hired professional companions, usually older women or widows who'd seen things. Their job was part nursemaid, part spy. They reported on behavior, discouraged lingering glances, and made sure that any accidental touching of hands during embroidery lessons remained purely theoretical. Among the working classes, things were looser, but not by much. In a small village, everyone was your chaperone. Your neighbors saw everything. Your mother knew where you were. And the baker's wife probably had something to say about who you were speaking to outside the church. The whole village operated on a kind of social surveillance network that would put modern CCTV to shame. Of course, this wasn't only about control. In some cases, it was also about protection. For young women, especially in cities, having a chaperone helped prevent unwanted advances. A market trip could quickly become a maze of catcalls or propositions. Having someone at your side, even a grandmother who walked slower than a donkey, could make all the difference. There were loopholes, of course. Human beings are nothing if not creative. Courting couples learned how to have conversations in code, using metaphors for affection and longing that would go unnoticed by their watchful guardians. They'd arrange meetings in crowded places, like markets or religious festivals, where a whispered word could pass undetected in the noise. Some even trained their pets. Yes, really to deliver small messages tied beneath collars or hidden in baskets of bread. And then there was church. Ironically, the most sacred place could also be the best place to flirt. During long services, glances could be exchanged over prayer books. A dropped kerchief might be accidentally returned with fingers brushing. The confessional booth wasn't just for sins sometimes, it was a place to whisper affection behind thick curtains and hushed voices. Still, the eyes were always there, watching from behind doors, from balconies, from pews, sometimes even from portraits' eyes painted to seem like they were following you. In some noble houses, letters were intercepted and read before they ever reached their destination. In monasteries, entire sections of sermons were devoted to warning about unsupervised passions. It wasn't enough to be pure. You had to look pure. Appearances mattered more than feelings. This constant supervision shaped the way people expressed love. It had to be quiet, clever, and coded. A certain flower tucked into a braid could mean, "I miss you." A shift in posture during a dance might signal interest. In this world, the smallest gestures carried enormous meaning, because they had to. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful. It meant that when affection slipped past the guards, it was deliberate. It was brave. Every word of love spoken through a wall, every glance stolen between shutters, was chosen with care and risked everything. Let's dim the torchlight for a moment and wander into the shadows, where not every love story was allowed to bloom. Because as much as the medieval world loved to write about romance, it had very strict opinions about who was allowed to fall in love and with whom. Start with class. A noblewoman falling for a blacksmith? That was a lovely story for minstrels to sing, but in real life, it was a scandal waiting to happen. Marriage was not just personal, it was political. It secured alliances, ensured land stayed in the right hands, and reinforced social order. So, when two people fell in love across class lines, it wasn't just frowned upon, it could destroy reputations, fortunes, and sometimes lives. We know of cases where noble daughters were quietly sent away to nunneries for loving the wrong man. Sons who defied marriage expectations could be disinherited or sent off to foreign campaigns. For peasants, the consequences were less dramatic, but still painful. If a serf fell in love with someone from another lord's estate, even that could spark a legal dispute, because technically, people were part of the property system. Then there were the religious boundaries. Christians were forbidden from marrying Jews or Muslims, and vice versa. Such unions were seen as dangerous, even treasonous. A few happened anyway, hidden, whispered, and often tragic. In some towns, couples would convert just to marry, only to be rejected by both communities. But perhaps the most dangerous kind of love was adulterous love. Marriage was often arranged, especially among the upper classes, and affection wasn't guaranteed. So when love appeared outside the marriage, it could be intoxicating and catastrophic. Adultery was not just a moral failing, it was a crime. For noble women, it could mean public disgrace, imprisonment, or even execution. Men usually got off lighter, but not always. If the affair threatened a powerful marriage alliance, even a knight could find himself on the wrong end of a sword. And yet, forbidden love stories flourished in the literature of the day. Think of Tristan and Isolde, whose love defied marriage, duty, and loyalty, or Lancelot and Guinevere, whose affair nearly brought down a kingdom. These stories were everywhere, told and retold in manor halls and village squares. Maybe because people saw themselves in them, in the longing, the fear, the thrill of secrecy. Some couples found clever ways to make it work. They used intermediaries, trusted servants or friends who passed messages, gifts, or glances. They wrote coded letters, using poetry or biblical references to cloak their meaning. They met in churches, forests, or behind market stalls, always watching their backs. But others were caught, and when they were, the punishments could be harsh. Whippings, exile, head shavings, public penance. In some cities, adulterers were forced to walk the streets in their undergarments, holding signs confessing their sins. Others were locked in pillories, mocked by the crowd. And yet people kept falling in love, kept risking it, because no matter how many rules society built around the heart, it never truly tamed it. And in that, maybe we see something timeless. Even in a world of chaperones, arranged marriages, and moral codes etched in stone, the human heart still found ways to speak, in whispers, in stolen moments, in dreams. By day, the medieval world belonged to duty, to work, to worship, to watching your every step. But nightfall changed things. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the torches flickered to life, a different world stirred. A quieter one, a riskier one, and for some, a more romantic one. Courtship in daylight often meant supervision. A chaperone, a curious sibling, a dozen nosy neighbors who all knew your family's name. But once darkness fell, the rules bent just a little. Night was the realm of the bold, the creative, and the deeply smitten. Lovers found ways to meet. Maybe it was a quick walk along the village edge. Maybe it was a pause at the public well. Maybe it was the bakery window, where you weren't really buying bread, you were exchanging glances, or maybe a token left between loaves. But more often, it was the forest path, the churchyard gate, or the edge of the fields where candles didn't reach. Moonlit walks became symbolic. They were dangerous, yes, but also sacred. To walk with someone under the stars was not just romantic, it was a sign of trust. You were risking your reputation, sometimes even your safety. And yet people did it, again and again. Many couples developed signals, a whispered phrase, a particular knock, a candle placed in a certain window. In one French town, lovers used laundry as code. A red cloth drying on the line meant, "Meet me tonight." A blue one, "My parents are watching." Even animals played a role. Dogs were trained to bark or stay silent on command. Medieval wingmen with fur and wagging tails. The most daring lovers climbed. Yes, really. Up walls, onto balconies, into windows. Not just the stuff of fairy tales it happened, and often ended with scraped knees, bruised egos, or angry fathers wielding broomsticks. Some towns even passed laws against ladder theft because so many young men were borrowing them to climb up to someone's chamber. Of course, these rendezvous didn't always go smoothly. There were close calls, torch-bearing patrols, jealous exes, and the occasional angry goose that blew your cover. But that unpredictability was part of the thrill. It added urgency, fire, and a touch of comedy to the already nerve-wracking experience of courtship. For the poor, privacy was especially rare. Homes were one-room huts with shared beds and creaky floors, so the outdoors became the escape. A tree stump became a bench. A rock became a shared seat. The stars, silent witnesses to whispered promises and hopeful goodbyes. For the rich, things were more complicated. Castles were full of eyes, servants, guards, gossiping maids. Some nobles built hidden passages or used secret stairways, and others simply bribed the help. Even love had a price tag. But no matter the status, the feelings were real. The butterflies, the awkward silences, the flushed cheeks. Even a century of arranged marriages couldn't kill off the human instinct to sneak out just to spend a moment with someone who made your heart beat louder than the church bell. So next time you see a clear night sky, think of them, the medieval lovers, tiptoeing in the dark, dodging angry parents and low-hanging branches, just for a single stolen moment. Because sometimes, even in an age of curfews and commandments, love still wrote its own rules by candlelight, under moonlight, and far from anyone else's gaze. In the medieval world, falling in love wasn't just a personal affair, it was a village project. From parents to priests, neighbors to nuns, everyone had an opinion. And in many cases, they didn't just offer advice, they interfered. Matchmaking wasn't a profession as much as it was a communal pastime. Your aunt might be your wingwoman. The local baker might suggest a suitor while handing you bread. Even the priest might drop a casual, "You know, the blacksmith's daughter is of age," right after confession. For wealthier families, matchmaking was serious business. Alliances meant power. Marriages were contracts, so negotiations could get intense. Fathers might haggle like merchants at market. "Your daughter brings 2 cows and a field? Well, my son is literate and has all his teeth." Not every match was about romance. Sometimes it was about sheep, vineyards, or how much silverware came with the bride. But that didn't stop people from hoping. Behind every strategic marriage was a teenager secretly wondering, will they at least be cute? Professional matchmakers did exist, though rarely in rural areas. In cities, they were known as go-betweens, or liaison women. Think of them as the original dating apps, except instead of swiping, they whispered gossip and delivered letters. They knew who had a good temperament, who had a bad temper, and who had an uncle in prison. All the essential info. Some regions even had festivals meant to stir up romance. In parts of France and Germany, towns held spring matchmaking games where boys and girls were paired off for the day, dancing, talking, awkward eye contact and all. In theory, it was innocent. In practice, many marriages began with those nervous handshakes. But not all matchmaking was welcome. Sometimes families forced the issue. A father might threaten to withhold inheritance. A mother might guilt-trip with tears. Siblings might tease relentlessly. If a match was considered advantageous, feelings became secondary. Love could wait. Land was eternal. And when things didn't go as planned, cue the meddling. A rejected suitor might go to the church and claim he was promised the bride. A spurned lover might write angry ballads. Parents might intervene with bribes, curses, or a firm grip on your elbow during every party. Of course, some young people pushed back. There are records of secret refusals, of teens hiding in barns to avoid betrothal talks, of letters pleading with friends for cover stories. Even in a world of obedience, resistance existed, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted. Yet for all the interference, not every matchmaker was a villain. Some truly wanted to help. Some were grandmothers who just wanted to see you happy. Some were friends who saw the way your eyes lit up when the tanner's apprentice passed by. And occasionally, the meddling worked. You'd hear it in stories told years later. "We were supposed to hate each other, but then he gave me a plum at the feast." Or, "My mother arranged it, and I was furious until he sang to me on our wedding night." Romance, even when wrangled into place, had a way of blooming anyway. So, if you think your family's nosy about your love life, be glad they don't carry marriage contracts in their coat pockets. In the Middle Ages, dating meant dealing with a dozen backseat cupids, some helpful, some chaotic, all deeply, deeply invested. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't always forever. Despite all the arranged marriages, whispered promises, and poetic gestures, relationships still crumbled. And when they did, things could get messy, very messy. You might think modern breakups are awkward, but imagine ending things when your village only had 90 people and you saw your ex every Thursday at the bread stall. The medieval world didn't have dating apps, but it absolutely had ghosting. In fact, it was one of the most common ways relationships ended. A lover might simply stop showing up at the well, stop writing letters, pretend to be deathly ill, or if things were especially bad, move to another village entirely. A clean break, no texts, no closure, just a slow fade out into the mist. But breakups weren't always one-sided. Sometimes there were loud, dramatic confrontations in the marketplace, accusations of betrayal, public crying. In small towns, emotions couldn't be contained behind closed doors. They leaked into the street like wine from a cracked barrel. Everyone noticed. And worse, everyone remembered. Church records even include formal complaints from jilted lovers. A man might claim that a woman accepted his gift of a comb, considered a semi-official sign of affection, only to turn around and marry someone else. In one case, from 14th century England, a woman was accused of keeping company with a man for sport, which sounds oddly familiar to modern phrases like leading someone on. Gossip was the medieval version of social media. If a couple split, the entire town dissected it. The baker might know before the best friend. The priest might bring it up in metaphor during a sermon. And children? Children repeated what they overheard, often loudly and inaccurately. No one was safe. Some breakups involved more than hurt feelings. Dowries could be demanded back, promises revoked. In serious cases, especially among the upper class, breakups could require arbitration. There are legal documents where parents tried to sue for emotional damage, or at least for reimbursement of a chicken given as a courtship gift. Emotional pain had an invoice. For women, breakups came with additional risks. A tarnished reputation could follow them for years, especially if accusations of inappropriate behavior were involved. Men had more leeway, but a pattern of broken promises could still get you branded as unreliable or worse, cursed by a disgruntled ex with a suspicious herbal hobby. But not every breakup was scandalous. Some ended in quiet resignation. Life was hard, and love wasn't always enough to overcome distance, family pressure, or a well-timed arranged marriage. There are even surviving letters that show exes parting with unexpected kindness, wishing each other health, good harvests, or better luck next time. And how did people cope with heartbreak? They sang. A lot. Ballads of lost love were popular across Europe. Some were heartbreaking, others humorous. A jester might joke about being dumped for a knight with shinier armor. A shepherdess might sing about the boy who left and the goat who stayed faithful. Music helped people grieve and helped others laugh at their pain. Some turned to saints. St. Valentine, unsurprisingly, became a patron of romantic struggles. Others prayed to St. Jude, patron, saint of hopeless causes. Candles were lit, prayers whispered, and sometimes revenge was plotted, although usually in the form of passive-aggressive embroidery or snide marketplace comments. But time moved on. New faces appeared at festivals. Eyes met again across church pews. Life was too short, and winters were too long, to stay heartbroken forever. So if you're lying in bed tonight, nursing your own romantic bruise, know this: you've got centuries of company. Breakups have always stung, always caused whispers, and always, eventually, faded like smoke from a hearth. One day, even in the Middle Ages, people found themselves laughing again, flirting again, risking their hearts all over. In a time before dating coaches and online compatibility tests, medieval people turned to something more ancient and far less predictable: magic. Yes, the heart wants what it wants, but sometimes it needed a little supernatural push. And in the medieval imagination, that meant love potions, enchanted tokens, and the occasional whispered spell beneath a full moon. Let's start with love potions. These were the medieval world's answer to swiping right only with fewer guarantees and more questionable ingredients. Common recipes included herbs like rosemary, thyme, and lavender, all associated with attraction and memory. But some got a little weirder. Mandrake root, which resembled a human form and supposedly screamed when pulled from the earth, was considered extremely powerful and dangerous. A few drops of mandrake in a drink might, it was believed, stir affection or madness. And yes, some ingredients were less poetic, like powdered beetles or bodily fluids. Some folk healers swore by potions made with items that belonged to the intended target: hair, nail clippings, or even a piece of clothing. It wasn't exactly subtle, but subtlety wasn't the goal. Desire was. And in matters of the heart, desperation often trumped dignity. Love spells were also popular. These weren't elaborate Harry Potter incantations, but simple chants or rhymes passed down through villages. A common one involved writing a lover's name on parchment, folding it with a pressed flower, and sleeping with it under the pillow. Another suggested whispering your crush's name into a well and tossing in a coin. If the water rippled 3 times, love was on the way. If it stayed still, better luck next harvest. Then there were talismans, little objects imbued with romantic hope. A carved heart-shaped stone, a braided ribbon, a brooch shaped like a bird. These were gifted quietly, often hidden in a pocket or sewn into a sleeve. The message wasn't always spoken aloud, but it was understood. I want you to think of me. In some cases, the church viewed these practices with suspicion. Love magic often blurred the line between superstition and sin. Clergy warned against using charms to bend the will of others, which was, frankly, fair. But for many peasants, these rituals weren't evil, they were just tradition. An emotional safety net in a world where choice in marriage was limited and emotional expression was risky. Women were especially drawn to love magic, not because they were more superstitious, but because they often had less power in relationships. A well-timed potion or whispered prayer might be their only tool for gaining control over their romantic fate. Older women, sometimes called wise women, midwives, or cunning folk, passed down these spells like recipes, along with stern warnings about consequences. Magic came with rules. You never cast a love spell during a thunderstorm. You never used a charm near a church. And if the spell worked, you never bragged. There were even unlove spells. Yes, breakups had magical protocols too. A jealous rival might bury a cursed object near a couple's home to sow discord. A wronged lover might burn a token to sever emotional ties. These weren't just dramatic gestures. They reflected a belief that feelings could be manipulated like crops or weather. That love, like anything else in nature, could be coaxed, redirected, or stopped. Of course, not all magic worked. Or if it did, the results weren't always ideal. There are stories sometimes half-joking about men falling in love with the wrong sister, or women who charmed a knight only to discover he was more interested in his horse. Magic could spark attraction, perhaps, but it couldn't create compatibility. And there were dangers. Using the wrong herb or mispronouncing a spell could lead to illness or worse. Some were even accused of witchcraft for trying to use love magic. Trials occurred, especially if someone believed a potion caused unnatural behavior. He looked at me differently, a wife might say, as if under a spell. It was a thin line between romance and risk. Still, the dream persisted, that maybe, just maybe, a pinch of time and a well-timed chant could bring 2 hearts together, that a charm tucked into a tunic could make someone's eyes linger a little longer, that magic, in its quiet, hopeful way, might help someone feel seen. So, the next time you light a candle, Think of them, those medieval romantics whispering into the night, herbs in hand, chasing love not with logic but with belief. Imagine you're strolling through a lively medieval fair. There's music, roasted meat, clanging blacksmiths, and children chasing geese. But woven between all of it quietly, strategically, are glances, introductions, and whispered assessments. Because beneath the songs and spices, this was also a marriage market. A place where love met logistics, and hearts were weighed alongside dowries. Not every fair was for matchmaking, of course, but many became unofficial meeting grounds. Families brought their sons and daughters dressed in their best. Not their richest, necessarily just enough to show they were respectable. Linen pressed, boots scrubbed, hair carefully braided or trimmed. Appearances mattered, but not too much. A young man who looked too vain might be dismissed as unreliable. A girl who looked too proud might be called difficult. The sweet spot was presentable and practical. It was a balancing act. Young people weren't always left to navigate these events alone. Parents hovered, friends nudged. Aunts dropped suspiciously specific hints like, "Oh look, the Cooper's son is here, and he's brought 2 pigs this year." It was matchmaking with the volume turned all the way up, and there was no swiping left. But fairs weren't the only venue. Church festivals, saints' days, and even funerals could become social opportunities. Anywhere people gathered, romance tried to squeeze through the cracks. And while not everyone came looking for love, many left with a story, a conversation that stuck, a glance that lingered, or a name they whispered into the firelight later that night. Marriage wasn't just about feelings, especially not for families trying to survive. A good match could mean access to land, better harvests, protection, or simply a bit more stability. So practical concerns often led the conversation. Does he own land? Can she spin wool? Do they have a strong back, a fertile history, a trustworthy uncle? Love might be the goal, but logistics paid the taxes. Dowries and bride prices were part of the deal. A bride's family might offer livestock, linens, or a bit of coin. The groom's family might present tools, promises, or housing arrangements. In some regions, it wasn't just about what was exchanged, it was about who witnessed it. A match confirmed before elders or respected merchants carried more weight. It wasn't just romantic, it was official. And what about second chances? Surprisingly common. Widows and widowers often returned to these social gatherings, sometimes with children in tow. They weren't shamed, in fact. Many were prized for their experience. A widow who could manage a household, or a man who had raised children alone, was seen as proven and reliable. Marriage wasn't just for the young. It was a tool, a partnership, a hope for comfort. Some towns even had designated spouse fields, open spaces at fairs where those seeking marriage could gather. It wasn't formal, just understood. If you stood there long enough, with open hands and hopeful eyes, someone might approach, or at least share a pair and a story. In a world where letters were rare and villages isolated, standing in a field was a declaration, "I am ready." But for all the planning and practicality, stories still bloomed. A mismatched couple dancing awkwardly, a baker's apprentice shyly offering a jam tart, a noble's daughter sneaking away from her chaperone just long enough to meet eyes with a stable boy. The logistics were necessary, but the sparks? They were still real. So next time you think of medieval fairs, don't just picture jugglers and mead, picture hearts cautiously opening, futures being considered, and love, humble and hopeful, slipping between trade stalls and under canvas tents. Not all love in medieval times fit neatly into the categories of betrothal, approval, and celebration. Some slipped through the cracks quiet, hidden, and dangerous. These were the stories of forbidden couples, defiant hearts, and romances that bloomed in the wrong village, the wrong social class, or under the wrong religion. If medieval society had rules, love occasionally tripped right over them. Class was a major boundary. A noblewoman falling in love with a blacksmith's apprentice might sound like a romantic fable, but in real life, it was scandal. Status wasn't just about pride. It meant property, influence, bloodlines, and political alliances. A noble marrying beneath them risked family shame and legal complications. Some families would disown their children, cut off dowries, or call in priests to dissolve any whisper of affection. And yet, it happened, because love is stubborn. Religion added another layer. In regions with both Christians and Jews, or Christians and Muslims, interfaith relationships were not only discouraged, they could be criminalized. Local laws might forbid such unions entirely, or require one partner to convert. Even then, suspicion lingered. Families feared their reputations would suffer, that their children wouldn't be accepted, or that they'd be shunned by their communities. Still, there are records buried in court archives and church documents of people who dared to defy this barrier. Some vanished into distant towns, others faced trials. A few simply lived quiet lives, hoping not to be noticed. Geography, too, created limits. Marrying someone from another village, even just 10 miles away, could be seen as risky. It meant unfamiliar customs, strange dialects, and uncertain alliances. Families wanted familiarity. A daughter marrying into a nearby farm kept the family connected. But love sometimes looked across the fields and saw something worth chasing. Letters were rare, but not unheard of. Messengers might carry secret notes between lovers. Songs were sung, tokens exchanged, and sometimes a stolen moment at a fair became the start of a lifelong bond. There were even couples who defied the entire concept of arranged marriage. Some simply refused. A daughter might flee her home, seeking sanctuary in a convent or in the house of a sympathetic relative. A son might disappear with a lover under cover of darkness. These stories rarely ended peacefully. Families sent out search parties, priests scolded, neighbors gossiped. But now and then, the runaways succeeded. They found a friendly priest, claimed consent had been given, and sealed the marriage before anyone could stop it. Legally binding, emotionally charged. Messy. Monastic life offered another kind of boundary. Monks and nuns were supposed to renounce romantic attachments, yet not all did. Some fell in love with each other, some with people from the outside world. Hidden letters, meeting spots near herb gardens or chapel alcoves, moments of contact during confession. It wasn't common, but it happened, and the consequences could be severe. Expulsion, public shame, or years of penance. Still, the heart wanted what it wanted, even behind stone walls. And then there were same-sex relationships, rarely recorded in detail, often shrouded in metaphor or accusation. In some places and times, such love was treated as heresy or deviance. In others, close same-sex bonds were tolerated as long as they remained discreet. Occasionally, 2 men or 2 women would arrange to live together under the guise of friendship or shared household. Historians still debate how many of these partnerships were romantic, but for the people living them, labels mattered less than loyalty and care. These boundary-crossing romances didn't usually end in public triumph, but they did exist. They flickered in letters, in poems, in court cases and rumors. Sometimes, they burned bright enough to be remembered centuries later. And while medieval society may not have celebrated these couples, they remind us that even in the most structured worlds, love finds a way to complicate everything. Let's set the scene. A quiet village, the moon hanging low, shutters drawn tight. Somewhere in the distance, a soft melody drifts through the darkness. This wasn't just a lullaby, it was a love song, a message meant for one heart and one heart only. In the medieval world, when open affection could be scandalous, people got creative. And that meant love often happened after dark. One of the most iconic symbols of medieval courtship was the serenade. It wasn't always as dramatic as the troubadours in poetry, but the idea was the same: singing to someone from below their window, hoping to be heard, maybe even invited in for conversation. Most of the time, nothing happened. The shutters stayed closed, but once in a while there'd be a flicker of candlelight or a note passed along the next morning by a trusted friend. In wealthier households, letters played a crucial role. They weren't just logistical, they were full of passion, metaphors, and carefully chosen phrases. A nobleman might compare his beloved to the Virgin Mary. A lady might quote a psalm to declare her loyalty. These letters were guarded like treasure. Some even travelled with the recipient to their grave. They were written in Latin, French, or the vernacular, depending on the couple's education. The most romantic ones were often copied and circulated, becoming anonymous inspiration for others. But what about commoners? Without paper, ink, or a household full of servants, they relied on more direct methods: carved symbols on trees, whispered words behind market stalls, gifts hidden in baskets, a ribbon, a sprig of herbs, a hand-carved token. It was less refined than courtly love, but no less meaningful. When you don't have a library, a single dried flower means everything. Nighttime, in general, gave lovers freedom they didn't have during the day. Chores were done, family eyes were tired, the village was still. Lovers might meet near a well, behind the church, or in the cover of nearby woods. Was it dangerous? Yes, but it was also exhilarating. Love and risk often walked hand in hand. And if you were lucky, your secret didn't turn into a scandal. Some communities developed whole systems for these late-night connections. In parts of the Alps, for example, young men practiced something called steckly zeal, where a boy would tap on a girl's window with a stick to signal interest. If she opened the window, they'd talk. If she didn't, he'd move along. It sounds strange now, but back then, it was a ritual, a structured dance with unspoken rules. The church, of course, frowned on this. Priests preached against moonlit meetings and unholy temptations. But even they knew love wasn't something that could be fully managed. And in some cases, they turned a blind eye as long as things didn't get out of hand. Even in cities, where space was tighter and eyes were everywhere, love still found gaps. Balconies made for good whispering spots. Courtyards had blind corners. Letters were passed through laundry lines or slipped into baskets under bread. The quiet chaos of urban life gave couples brief pockets of privacy. Of course, not every night romance was tender. Some were driven by pressure, desperation, or one-sided desire. That's a darker part of medieval love, the part with power imbalances, forced marriages, or coercion. But tonight, let's focus on the moments of genuine connection, the honest ones. The nights when two people, regardless of class or background, found a way to say, "I see you, I choose you." So the next time you hear a quiet song at night, or feel a breeze that carries something unspoken, imagine a young couple centuries ago, stealing a few moments under the stars. No phones, no lights. Just breath, courage, and the hope that the one they love is listening. So, let's say your medieval marriage has been arranged. You've said the vows, you've endured the feast, and you've even survived the awkward bedding ceremony. Life should settle into routine, right? Well, not always. Because love, or at least desire, isn't always well behaved. And in the Middle Ages, cheating wasn't just risky, it could be downright dangerous. Let's get this straight. Adultery happened. A lot. It may surprise you, given all the rules and religious warnings, but medieval folks were just as complicated and curious as we are. Temptation existed. Opportunities appeared. And not everyone stuck to the script. But before we dive into the scandal, Let's define what adultery actually meant back then. The church considered it a grave sin. For men, sleeping with a married woman, even if he was single, was adultery. For women, sleeping with anyone other than their husband was adultery, no matter the situation. The imbalance was real, and yes, deeply unfair. The consequences could be harsh. If caught, punishment ranged from public shaming to excommunication. In some places, nobles might be fined or banished. Peasants might be flogged or paraded through town. And for women, the social fallout could be brutal. A woman accused of adultery could be disowned by her family, thrown out of her home, or even imprisoned in a convent, whether or not the accusation was true. Despite the risks, illicit affairs did happen, and they came in many forms. Some were secret flings between neighbors. Some were long-running romances behind closed doors. And some played out in castles, courts, or cloisters, with all the drama of a soap opera. One famous example, King Philip IV of France and the scandal of his daughters-in-law. Around 1314, rumors spread that two of his sons' wives were having affairs with knights from the royal household. An investigation followed. Torture was involved, and two women were found guilty, their lovers executed gruesomely. The princesses were imprisoned for life. It was messy, political, and deeply tragic, all because of forbidden love and court gossip. But not every affair ended in execution. Some managed to fly under the radar. In towns and villages, affairs might unfold in secret behind haylofts, during festivals, or in stolen moments between chores. There are court records of women sneaking off with lovers while their husbands were out at the fields, of men slipping away to visit women in nearby parishes, even of priests, yes, priests being accused of seducing their parishioners. Monasteries and nunneries weren't immune either. Despite vows of chastity, some monks and nuns engaged in secret relationships. There are recorded cases of cloister walls being climbed, of love letters passed through cracks, of pregnant nuns being quietly relocated. It was risky, but love, or lust, has always found a way. Of course, not all cheating was romantic. Sometimes it was transactional. Prostitutes existed in every medieval town, sometimes licensed, sometimes persecuted, always controversial. The church condemned them, but cities taxed them. Brothels were both public secrets and essential safety valves for the male population. And married men, predictably, made up a good portion of their clientele. There were also cunning strategies for covering one's tracks. Lovers arranged secret signals like placing a candle in a certain window or wearing a specific color on feast days. Some used go-betweens, trusted servants or neighbors who carried messages. Others met at churches, not for worship, but because it was one of the few places they could blend in with a crowd. Confessionals sometimes hid more than sins. But here's the thing. Cheating wasn't always about passion. Sometimes it was about power. A noble might seduce a servant to prove dominance. A landowner might exploit a widow in need. These stories are darker, uncomfortable, but part of the historical truth. Not every affair was a love story. And let's not forget jealousy. Accusations of infidelity, true or not, could destroy reputations. Women were especially vulnerable. A husband might accuse his wife of cheating to gain legal control, to shame her family, or to avoid giving her property. Sometimes, even dreams were considered suspicious. If a man dreamed that his wife had a lover, it might be taken as a sign, especially if the local priest had a flair for drama. Interestingly, some communities tried to manage temptation with custom. In parts of medieval England and France, certain festivals became social pressure valves, moments where rules bent just slightly. On May Day or Carnival, flirtation was tolerated, even encouraged. People dressed up, wore masks, danced together. Sometimes it was harmless fun, sometimes less so. There were even love spells. Yes, actual spells. People visited folk healers or cunning women to gain charms that might inspire affection or prevent a lover from straying. These spells involved herbs, whispered prayers, symbolic knots, or even nail clippings. Most were harmless, some bordered on creepy. But the belief in their power shows how desperate people were to hold on to love, or at least control it. And what about the children born from these affairs? Illegitimacy carried real stigma. Bastards, as they were called, often couldn't inherit land or titles, but they weren't always outcasts. Some were raised quietly within families. Others found places in monasteries, military ranks, or trade guilds. And a few, like William the Conqueror, rose to power despite the label. As always, the church tried to maintain order. Confession and penance were encouraged. Sinners were told to fast, pray, give alms, or make pilgrimages. The idea was to cleanse the soul, but it didn't always stop the behavior. Adultery, like gossip and gluttony, remained stubbornly popular. In the end, medieval cheating was a reflection of medieval life. Messy, complex, and human. Love didn't always follow the rules. Desire didn't wait for permission. And the heart, however inconvenient, often had plans of its own. So next time someone tells you people in the Middle Ages were more moral or more disciplined, just smile quietly. Then tell them about the nun who escaped her convent to meet her lover behind the tannery. Or the lord who built a secret staircase to his maid's chamber. Or the peasant girl who wore a red ribbon to signal her affection right under her husband's nose. Because in every age, love makes fools. And sometimes, fools make history. In medieval times, expressing love was not as straightforward as simply saying, "I love you." Social norms, family oversight, and the ever-watchful eyes of the community meant that lovers had to speak a language of symbols and gestures, a delicate dance of meaning woven into everyday actions. This silent vocabulary allowed feelings to be conveyed without words, letting affection bloom discreetly within the strict rules of the era. Take gifts, for instance. They were never just ordinary presents. Every flower, ribbon, or carved trinket held significance beyond its surface. A single red rose wasn't just a pretty token, it symbolized passionate love or deep desire, but timing was crucial. Presenting that same rose at the wrong moment could be scandalous. Similarly, ribbons of certain colors, blue for loyalty, green for hope, red for love, were worn or given as subtle signs of romantic interest or availability. Wooden tokens were especially popular among peasants and townsfolk. A carved spoon, for example, was a traditional gift representing a promise of shared life and sustenance, a symbol that the giver hoped to nurture a home together. Locks of hair were treasured keepsakes, tangible pieces of oneself that symbolized trust and intimacy. Lovers might exchange handkerchiefs, embroidered with secret messages, or family crests, carrying not only romantic meaning, but also a sense of belonging and identity. Gestures carried similar weight. A gentle touch on a sleeve during a festival, a lingering bow, or a glance held just a beat too long could convey interest without a single word. But these signals required careful interpretation. Misreading a gesture could lead to confusion, embarrassment, or worse, social censure. Thus, both sender and receiver had to be fluent in this unspoken language, aware of nuance and context. Poetry and music formed another crucial part of this symbolic communication. Troubadours and minstrels traveled from town to town, singing songs filled with metaphor and allegory. Knights composed verses praising their ladies' virtues, comparing their eyes to stars, or their voices to gentle windscrafting, a romantic ideal that was both public and coded. For the intended listener, these songs were clear declarations of affection, while for others, they remained beautiful but vague stories. Communities themselves became adept at reading these signals. Families, neighbors, and even rivals recognized the subtle signs of courtship, turning romance into a social performance layered with meaning. A young woman's choice of attire, a young man's gift, or a well-timed smile became part of a broader dialogue understood by many but spoken by few. This elaborate system served several purposes. It protected reputations, allowed families to maintain control, and preserved the delicate balance between personal desire and public expectation. It was a way for love to flourish in a world where openness was risky and discretion was valued. In essence, the symbolism and gestures of medieval romance were more than mere quaint customs. They were a complex language and artful dance of expression and interpretation that enabled connection within the strict confines of society. Through this silent conversation, lovers navigated the delicate paths of desire, honor, and tradition, crafting stories that echo through history as quietly powerful testimonies of the human heart. In a world ruled by rigid social codes, watchful families, and ever-present community eyes, night offered a different kind of freedom. Darkness became a veil, concealing the quiet rebellions of lovers who dared to meet beyond the prying gazes of chaperones and neighbors. For many medieval couples, the true moments of connection happened after sunset under moonlight, beneath stars, and often along secret paths known only to a trusted few. Unlike today's digital whispers and private texts, medieval lovers had to rely on physical presence, stealth, and cunning. To meet a beloved at night was both thrilling and dangerous. The slightest sound, a snapped twig, a loose shutter could expose them to scandal or worse. In many villages, families guarded their daughters with vigilance, knowing that a stolen moment could lead to a ruined reputation or an unwanted pregnancy. These nighttime meetings often took place in gardens, orchards, or hidden glens just beyond the village limits. Lovers might climb over fences or slip through hedgerows, carrying tokens or small gifts to exchange under the moon's watchful eye. Such places were charged with secrecy and magic, a world apart from the daylight's rules and expectations. Stories passed down through generations tell of love ladders, improvised ropes or wooden steps used to scale walls and reach a waiting window or balcony. Such escapes required not only courage, but careful planning, as a fall might bring injury, or worse, discovery. In some towns, a well-placed bucket of water or an alert guard was enough to end a romance before it began. Superstitions mingled with these acts of defiance. It was believed that certain nights, especially around the full moon, held particular power for lovers. Moonlight was said to strengthen bonds, inspire passion, and even bless secret meetings with good fortune. Conversely, a dream on such a night-off meeting or losing a beloved might be seen as prophecy, a hint of what was to come. However, love after dark was not without its perils. Punishments for clandestine meetings ranged from public humiliation to fines or exile. In some regions, families might retaliate violently to protect their honor. The risk of being caught forced lovers to be inventive and discreet, heightening the sense of urgency and intensity in their meetings. Even beyond human danger, night itself was seen as a realm of mystery and vulnerability. Dark forests were believed to be inhabited by spirits or creatures that could harm the unwary. Travelers were advised against wandering after dark, and lovers took extra care to avoid both natural and supernatural threats. Despite these dangers, nighttime love endured. It was a testament to human longing, willing to challenge rules, brave risks, and seek connection in the shadows. These stolen moments under the stars carried a poignancy that daylight encounters often lacked. The very act of meeting in secret made love feel precious, urgent, and alive. For medieval people, night was more than a time to re-sit, was a realm where love could be claimed, tested, and treasured away from the rigid structures of society. In the quiet hush of darkness, lovers found a fragile freedom to be themselves, to whisper hopes and dreams, and to weave the invisible threads of their stories. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine those secret paths, the soft rustle of leaves, and two shadowed figures daring to reach for each other in a world that demanded they hide. Because sometimes, the greatest stories of love are the ones whispered only in the night,